After my father's funeral, my sister banged her fist on the table and said, "Dad promised me half of your business, so hand over the keys now." She even waved a signed paper in my face. I tried to hold back my laughter, because my father had already moved his assets into my name. I, 34 stood in the corner of the funeral home's reception area, watching my sister work the room like she was campaigning for office. She hadn't seen our father in 3 years, but there she was, dabbing at dry eyes with a tissue, accepting condolences from relatives who didn't know any better. The whole performance made my stomach turn, but I kept my mouth shut. Dad had taught me that patience was a weapon, and I was about to use it. The funeral itself had been simple, exactly what Dad wanted. No theatrical displays, no melodrama. Just a quiet service with people who actually knew him, who'd been there during the rough years when he built his construction business from nothing. My sister hadn't been there for any of that. She'd been too busy living off her trust fund in California, calling once every few months to ask for money, always with some new crisis that required immediate financial intervention. After the last mourners filed out, my sister suggested we meet at Dad's lawyer's office the next morning. She said it would be easier to handle everything professionally, with proper documentation. I agreed, keeping my expression neutral, though I knew exactly what was coming. Dad had warned me 6 months ago, right after she'd called him again, this time demanding an advance on her inheritance to invest in some cryptocurrency scheme her boyfriend was running. That night, I sat in Dad's study, the same room where he'd called me in late one evening and told me we needed to talk. He'd looked tired, more tired than usual, and I knew his heart condition was getting worse. He asked me if I remembered the warehouse property on 5th Street, the one he'd bought for almost nothing back in the 90s. I did. It was worth millions now, sitting in the middle of what had become the city's hottest development zone. Then he asked me if I remembered the commercial building downtown, the office complex he'd renovated 5 years ago. I remembered that too. Finally, he asked if I knew about the investment portfolio he'd been building for 2 decades. I told him I knew about some of it, and he smiled that sad smile of his. He said he was proud of me, proud of how I'd worked alongside him since I was 16, learning every aspect of the business, from pouring concrete to reading contracts. He said my sister had made her choices, and he tried to help her, tried to guide her, but she only ever saw him as a bank account. Then he told me about the meeting he'd had with his attorney that afternoon. Everything was being transferred into my name, effective immediately. The business, the properties, the investments, all of it. He was keeping enough for his own care and comfort, but the rest was mine. I tried to argue, told him he didn't have to do this, that maybe my sister would change. He just shook his head and said he'd given her plenty of chances, plenty of opportunities to be part of the family business, to show even the slightest interest in anything other than what she could extract from him. He said this wasn't about punishment. It was about protecting what he'd built and making sure it went to someone who understood its value. The next morning, I arrived at the lawyer's office 10 minutes early. My sister was already there, sitting in the waiting room with a man I didn't recognize. She introduced him as her financial advisor, which seemed odd for a will reading, but I didn't comment. The lawyer, Mr. Harrison, had worked with Dad for 30 years. He ushered us into his conference room with the kind of somber professionalism you'd expect from someone who'd just lost a longtime client and friend. We settled into the leather chairs, and I noticed my sister had a leather portfolio in front of her. She kept glancing at it, then at me, with this barely contained excitement that she was trying to mask as grief. Mr. Harrison began with the standard preliminaries, expressing his condolences, explaining the process, all the usual formalities. My sister kept shifting in her seat, clearly impatient to get to what she considered the important part. Then it happened. Before Mr. Harrison could even open Dad's will, my sister reached into her portfolio and pulled out a document. She stood up, slapped it down on the table, and declared that Dad had promised her half of the business. She said she had it in writing, right here, signed and dated just 6 months ago. She demanded I hand over the keys to the office and the construction yard immediately. I looked at the document. It was impressive, I had to admit. Professional letterhead, Dad's signature at the bottom, very official looking. It stated that he intended to split the business equally between his 2 children, with my sister receiving full ownership and operational control of half the company's assets, including the 5th Street property and a 50% stake in the construction business. The signature looked real enough, and it was dated about a week after Dad and I had our conversation in his study. My sister crossed her arms and told me she'd been patient long enough. She said Dad had finally recognized her value, her business acumen, and wanted to make things right. She claimed they'd had several long conversations about her ideas for modernizing the company, and he'd been impressed enough to formalize this agreement. She looked at Mr. Harrison and asked him to begin the process of transferring her share immediately. I caught Mr. Harrison's eye, and I saw something there, a slight tightening around his mouth that might have been anger or might have been amusement. He asked my sister if he could examine the document. She pushed it across the table to him with a satisfied smile. He studied it for what felt like an eternity, his expression never changing. Then he set it down gently and asked my sister where she'd obtained this document. She said Dad had sent it to her via email, along with a letter explaining his decision. She'd had it printed and kept it safe, knowing it would be important. Mr. Harrison nodded slowly, then asked if she had the original email. She fumbled with her phone, clearly not expecting this question, and said she'd have to look for it. She claimed her boyfriend had helped her organize her files and might have archived it. Mr. Harrison turned to me and asked if I had anything to add. I said I'd let him continue with Dad's actual will, the one he drafted and witnessed in his office. My sister's face flushed red, and she insisted her document was legal and binding. She raised her voice, saying I'd always been Dad's favorite, always gotten everything, and this was her chance to finally get what she deserved. That's when Mr. Harrison opened his briefcase and pulled out a thick folder. He explained that my father had indeed made significant changes to his estate 6 months ago, but not the changes my sister was describing. He laid out document after document showing the systematic transfer of assets into my name. The business, the properties, the investments, everything had been legally transferred months ago. Dad had retained only his personal accounts and the house, which was to be sold with proceeds split between us, a gesture he'd insisted on despite my protests. My sister's face went from red to white. She grabbed her document and shook it, insisting it was real, it was signed, Dad had promised her. Mr. Harrison asked her again about the email, and she started talking faster, saying it must have been deleted accidentally, that her boyfriend would remember seeing it, that this was all some kind of conspiracy to cheat her out of her inheritance. Mr. Harrison let her finish, then he delivered the final blow. He explained that he'd been concerned when my father first mentioned that someone might try to forge documents, so they'd taken extra precautions. Every legitimate document Dad signed in the final year of his life was not only witnessed, but also recorded. He pulled out a small tablet and showed us a video, dated 1 week after the supposed agreement my sister was waving around. In it, Dad sat in Mr. Harrison's office, clearly stated that he had not and would not be creating any documents promising business assets to his daughter, and that any such documents bearing his signature should be considered fraudulent. Dad looked directly into the camera and said he was making this recording because his daughter had become increasingly desperate in her attempts to access his money. He said he loved her, but he couldn't trust her, and he needed to protect the legacy he'd built. He said he hoped she'd eventually understand that real wealth came from hard work and integrity, not from manipulation and forgery. The room went silent. My sister's financial advisor quietly excused himself and left. She stood there, holding her forged document, her whole body trembling. She turned to me with pure hatred in her eyes and accused me of poisoning Dad against her, of manipulating an old sick man into cutting her out. She said I'd stolen her inheritance, that I'd always been jealous of her, always wanted everything for myself. I finally spoke. I told her that Dad had made his decision based on decades of her behavior, not anything I'd done. I reminded her of all the times she'd called asking for money, never once asking how he was feeling, how his health was, whether he needed anything. I mentioned the time he'd had his first heart attack, and she hadn't even bothered to visit, just sent a text asking if he'd updated his insurance beneficiaries. I brought up every missed birthday, every forgotten holiday, every promise she'd broken to visit or call, or just be present in any meaningful way. She screamed that I had no right to judge her, that she'd had her own life to live, her own problems to deal with. She said Dad had been controlling and difficult, always demanding she live life his way. I asked her to name one time Dad had demanded anything from her except basic decency and occasional communication. She couldn't. Mr. Harrison interrupted and said we could continue this discussion elsewhere. but he had other appointments. He handed me a folder containing all the relevant documents and told my sister that if she had questions about the will's validity, she was welcome to contest it in court, though he strongly advised against it given the evidence he had. She snatched up her forged document and stormed out, her heels clicking angrily against the marble floor. I sat there for a moment, feeling drained. Mr. Harrison poured me a glass of water and told me he was sorry I had to deal with this on top of losing my father. He said Dad had known this confrontation was coming and had wanted to spare me as much trouble as possible. That's why he'd been so thorough with the documentation, so meticulous with the recordings and transfers. He'd wanted to make sure there was no ambiguity, no room for legal challenges or family warfare. I asked Mr. Harrison if he thought she'd actually try to sue. He said she might, but it would be expensive and ultimately futile. The transfers had been legal, properly executed, and clearly reflected Dad's wishes. Unless she could prove Dad had been mentally incompetent at the time, which the multiple medical evaluations in the file would contradict, she didn't have a case. The forged document, if anything, would work against her if this went to court. Over the next few weeks, I focused on managing Dad's business and handling the estate. The house sold quickly, and I made sure my sister got her half of the proceeds, exactly as Dad had specified. She didn't thank me. Instead, I got a letter from an attorney threatening legal action. I forwarded it to Mr. Harrison, who sent back a response so thoroughly documented and legally airtight that I never heard from that lawyer again. Update 1. 3 months after the funeral, I was working late at the construction office when I got a call from an unknown number. I almost didn't answer, but something made me pick up. It was my sister's ex-boyfriend, the one who'd been at the funeral. He asked if we could meet, said he had information I needed to know. I was suspicious, but curious enough to agree to coffee the next day. He showed up looking rough, like he hadn't slept much. He told me he and my sister had broken up shortly after the will reading, that she'd become increasingly unstable, obsessed with the idea that I'd stolen from her. But that wasn't why he wanted to talk. He said he needed to confess something that had been eating at him. He was the one who'd helped her forge the document. She'd convinced him that Dad had promised her half the business verbally, multiple times, and that she just needed written proof of what was rightfully hers. She'd shown him examples of Dad's signature, and he'd practiced until he could replicate it convincingly. They'd used business letterhead she'd stolen from Dad's office years ago, back when she still occasionally visited. He believed her story, believed she was being cheated by a controlling father and a greedy brother. But after the will reading, after seeing the video and hearing Mr. Harrison's explanation, he'd realized the truth. My sister had lied to him, used him to commit fraud, and he'd been stupid enough to go along with it. He said he couldn't live with the guilt anymore. He'd broken up with her when she started talking about finding other ways to contest the will, other angles to exploit. He'd seen a side of her that terrified him, a willingness to destroy anyone who stood between her and what she wanted. He asked if I was going to press charges. I told him I hadn't decided yet, that I'd need to think about it. He nodded and said he understood, that he deserved whatever consequences came his way. Then he told me one more thing. He said my sister had been planning this for over a year, that she'd known about Dad's heart condition and had been calculating how to maximize her take once he was gone. She'd tried to get Dad to sign various documents under the guise of helping him organize his affairs, but he'd always refused to sign anything without his lawyer present. I felt sick listening to this, but also vindicated. Dad had known. He'd seen through her, understood exactly what she was capable of, and had protected his legacy accordingly. I thanked the ex-boyfriend for his honesty and told him I'd be in touch. I never did press charges. It seemed like enough that he had to live with what he'd done, and honestly, I didn't want to drag this out any longer than necessary. The business was thriving. I'd implemented some of the expansion plans Dad and I had discussed, and we just won a major contract for a mixed-use development downtown. I hired additional crew, invested in new equipment, and started mentoring some of the younger guys the way Dad had mentored me. It felt right, like I was honoring his memory by building on what he'd started. Update 2. 6 months after Dad's death, I got a call from a hospital about 40 miles away. My sister had been brought in after a car accident. Nothing life-threatening, but serious enough that she'd be there for a few days. They'd called me because I was listed as her emergency contact, something she apparently never bothered to update. I hesitated, part of me wanting to just ignore it, but Dad's voice in my head reminded me that family was family, even when they disappointed you. I drove out there the next day. She was in a private room, her leg in a cast, various bruises and cuts visible on her exposed skin. She looked surprised to see me, then angry, then something I couldn't quite identify. I asked how she was doing, and she said she'd been better. We sat in awkward silence for a moment. Then she told me she'd been driving back from meeting with another lawyer, one who'd finally been honest enough to tell her she didn't have a case. She'd spent tens of thousands of dollars on legal consultations, all of them reaching the same conclusion. Dad's will was solid, the transfers were legitimate, and her forged document would only get her in trouble if she kept pushing. She'd been crying while driving, not paying attention, and had rear-ended someone at a red light. She said she'd lost everything. Her boyfriend had left her, her friends had distanced themselves once the money stopped flowing, and she'd burned through most of her trust fund on legal fees and bad investments. She looked at me and asked why I'd come. I told her I didn't really know, that maybe some part of me still remembered when we were kids, before money and resentment had poisoned everything between us. She started crying then, real tears this time, not the performance from the funeral. She said she was sorry, that she'd been awful, that she'd been so focused on what she thought she deserved that she'd forgotten to be a decent person. She said Dad had tried to tell her, tried to help her understand, but she'd been too stubborn and too proud to listen. Now she had nothing, and she finally understood what he'd been trying to teach her. I didn't know if I believed her, if this was genuine remorse or just another angle, but I told her I'd help her with the medical bills. She tried to refuse, said she didn't deserve it, but I insisted. I told her Dad had left her the house proceeds, and if she'd already spent it, that was on her, but I wasn't going to let her drown in medical debt. It wasn't about her, it was about being the kind of person Dad had raised me to be. Over the next few months, we had occasional contact. She got into therapy, started dealing with some of the issues that had driven her behavior for years. She moved to a smaller apartment, got a regular job managing a retail store, started living within her means. She called me once to thank me for paying her hospital bills and to apologize again, more specifically this time, for everything she'd put me and Dad through. I couldn't forgive her completely, not yet. The wounds were too fresh, the betrayal too deep. But I could acknowledge that she was trying, that she was making an effort to be better. Dad would have wanted that, would have wanted both his children to find some kind of peace, even if we'd never be close again. Update 3. A year after Dad's funeral, I stood at his grave on the anniversary of his death. The business had doubled in size. We'd completed 3 major projects, and I'd just been approached about a possible acquisition that would expand us into neighboring states. Everything Dad had built, everything he'd worked for, was not just surviving but thriving. I heard footsteps behind me and turned to find my sister walking up the path. She carried a small bouquet of flowers, the simple kind Dad had always preferred. We stood there together, neither of us speaking for a long moment. Then she placed her flowers next to mine and told Dad she was sorry, that she finally understood what he'd been trying to teach her, that she wished she'd figured it out before it was too late. She turned to me and said she didn't expect forgiveness, didn't expect us to suddenly become close. But she wanted me to know that she was grateful I'd handled everything the way I had, that I'd shown her more grace than she deserved. She said seeing the business succeed, knowing that Dad's legacy was in good hands, brought her more peace than any amount of money could have. I told her Dad had loved her, even when he was disappointed in her, even when he was protecting his assets from her. I said he'd hoped she'd eventually find her way, and maybe she was starting to. She nodded, wiped her eyes, and said she'd let me have my time alone. As she walked away, I felt something shift, not forgiveness exactly, but maybe the possibility of it someday. I stayed at the grave for another hour, talking to Dad in my head, telling him about the business, about the plans for expansion, about the legacy he'd left that was so much bigger than just money or property. He'd taught me about integrity, about hard work, about standing firm when people tried to take advantage. He'd shown me that real success wasn't measured in dollars, but in the values you upheld and the people you helped along the way. The revenge I'd thought I wanted, the satisfaction of watching my sister fail, had turned hollow. The real victory was in building something worthwhile, in honoring Dad's memory through action rather than spite. She'd faced the consequences of her choices, that was true, but I didn't need to twist the knife. Living well, building successfully, maintaining my integrity even when it would have been easier to be cruel, That was the real revenge. That was what Dad had taught me, and that was the legacy I'd carry forward.